The morning sun poured lazily through the lace curtains of Maplecroft Cottage, casting a delicate lattice of light across the polished wooden floor. It was the sort of morning that invited civility. The aroma of fresh scones wafted from the kitchen, and birds chirped in measured harmony outside. In the village of St. Mary Mead, such tranquility was rarely punctuated by anything more exciting than the arrival of a new postman, or the occasional tip from Mrs. Price at the bakery. Yet today promised a small deviation from routine. The occasion was Miss Marple's weekly tea gathering, an informal affair that brought together a motley mix of villagers, widows seeking conversation, young matrons eager for gossip, and the occasional traveler who had strayed off the main road. The tea table was set in the sitting room with meticulous care. China cups aligned precisely, a vase of daffodils at the center, and the delicate scent of Earl Grey filling the room. Miss Marple herself, petite and unobtrusive, sat quietly near the window. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, a rhythm as comforting as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. She observed her guests with a gentle, almost imperceptible curiosity, noting the slight tension in Mrs. Ledger's shoulders, the careful avoidance of eye contact by young Miss Hamilton, and the nervous habit of Mr. Faraday, who tapped a silver spoon against his cup far too frequently. Just as the conversation began to lull into polite small talk, a sharp knock on the door broke the calm. It was the village postman, a man as reliable as the sunrise, but his face bore an expression unusual enough to draw a collective glance from the assembled company. "Telegram, Miss Marple," he announced, handing her a small yellow envelope. The room hushed. Telegrams were rare now, often reserved for urgent or grave matters. Miss Marple, unperturbed, carefully opened it. Her eyes scanned the brief lines of typewritten text. A faint frown creased her brow. She read the words twice, then placed the telegram gently on the mantelpiece, as if setting down a fragile object. "It is most unfortunate," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest to hear. Mrs. Ledger, ever eager for drama, leaned forward. "Unfortunate? What is it, Miss Marple? Do tell." But Miss Marple's lips remained a thin line. She only shook her head slightly and returned to her knitting, though her mind was already at work, picking apart the strands of human behavior and circumstance that might surround this sudden note of distress. For the villagers, it was clear only that something grave, had arrived, wrapped in yellow paper and typewritten letters. None could yet imagine that this small telegram would unravel more than the morning's serenity. It would uncover long-buried secrets, test loyalties, and eventually bring a shadow of murder into the very heart of St. Mary Mead. And as Miss Marple's sharp eyes flicked once more to the innocuous envelope on the mantelpiece, a small, knowing smile touched the corners of her lips. She had seen such beginnings before, and she understood that in a quiet village, even the gentlest ripple could hide a deadly undertow. The telegram on the mantelpiece had cast a quiet shadow over the room, and though the tea continued to be poured and polite conversation resumed, an unmistakable tension lingered in the air. Mrs. Ledger, cheeks flushed with curiosity and a touch of impatience, could not resist breaking the silence. "Do you mean to tell us, Miss Marple, that this is something serious?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her eyes calm and reflective. "I should not speculate, my dear, for I know so little. But telegrams at this hour are seldom sent for matters of mere civility. One must always be prepared for the unexpected." Her voice was gentle, almost dismissive, yet it carried an undercurrent that made everyone lean a little closer, as though drawn by the quiet gravity of her words. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead hummed along its usual course. Mrs. Price was arranging freshly baked tarts in the bakery window. The church bells marked noon, and children ran with their small errands, laughing carelessly. Yet inside Maplecroft Cottage, the sense of unease grew, nurtured by whispered speculations. Mr. Faraday, nervously adjusting his spectacles, leaned toward Miss Marple. "Do you think it could be some business matter? Perhaps a financial emergency?" Miss Marple shook her head, not looking up. "It may be, or it may be something far more personal. Telegrams seldom arrive without purpose, and they often carry a weight beyond what is immediately obvious." This subtle hint of something deeper seemed to ignite a spark of imagination in the guests. Miss Hamilton, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. Could it be about Mr. Everard? I heard something dreadful happened at his estate last night. Or perhaps it is about the new family in Heatherton Lane. People say there has been tension ever since they arrived." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting needles. She had indeed heard murmurs regarding both Mr. Everard and the newcomers, but she chose not to comment. Instead, she observed more closely the reactions around her. The tightening of shoulders, the fidgeting, the subtle glance exchanged between Mrs. Ledger and Mr. Faraday. Every movement, every hesitance was a thread in the larger pattern she quietly began to trace. By mid-afternoon, word of the telegram had spread beyond the confines of Maplecroft Cottage. The village seemed to vibrate with a nervous energy. At the Red Lion, the innkeeper relayed that some urgent news had reached the household of the Everards. At the post office, gossip mingled with letters and parcels, each villager adding their own twist to the story. Even the Reverend Cole, usually a bastion of calm, found himself caught in speculation, questioning the propriety of such matters being whispered so freely. Yet amid the chatter and conjecture, Miss Marple remained serene. She sipped her tea slowly, allowing each remark to pass through her mind as one would sift through the pages of a book, noting not only the words, but the subtler signs, the hesitation before a reply, the sudden change in posture, the faint tightening around a mouth that otherwise smiled politely. It was here, in these small, nearly imperceptible moments, that the truth often revealed itself long before the more obvious clues. As the day wore on, a plan began to form in her mind. She would visit the Everard estate in the evening, under the pretext of delivering a message of sympathy, and observe quietly. Miss Marple understood that in St. Mary Mead appearances were carefully maintained, and only patience and keen observation could uncover the layers of tension lurking beneath the surface. She glanced at the yellow envelope once more, its presence on the mantelpiece a silent, insistent summons to unravel what lay hidden. By dusk, the village had transformed from a picture of tranquil routine into a place vibrating with undercurrents of unease, and Miss Marple, ever patient and unassuming, prepared herself to follow these currents wherever they might lead, aware that even the gentlest surface could conceal a deadly depth. As twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the neat hedgerows and cobbled lanes, Miss Marple donned her shawl and set out toward the Everard estate. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and the first hints of approaching spring. She walked at a leisurely pace, as though on a mere evening stroll, all the while observing the subtle signs that might betray unease. A gate left ajar, the flicker of lights in upper windows, the hurried step of a servant hurrying past. Upon arrival, she was greeted by a subdued household. The Everard family, usually so cordial and lively, now moved with measured, almost careful motions. Mr. Everard, a man of considerable presence yet naturally reserved, met her in the drawing-room with a polite bow. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight with restraint, "I am most grateful you called. These past hours have been trying." Miss Marple, settling into a comfortable chair as though she were merely paying a social call, nodded. "I received a telegram this morning," she said softly, "and though I do not presume to understand all its implications, I thought it only right to come and see you." A silence followed, punctuated by the faint ticking of a mantel clock. It was Mrs. Everard who broke it, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes betraying the strain she so carefully concealed. "It arrived just after breakfast," she murmured. "A telegram from London. My brother, he—" She faltered, unable to complete the sentence. Miss Marple inclined her head, letting her silence encourage explanation without pressure. "He is in danger, perhaps," she suggested gently. "Yes," Mrs. Everard whispered. "Or worse. It is impossible to know until one hears more. But there are threats, Miss Marple. Threats from someone I cannot name. And now—" Her voice broke, and she dabbed at her eyes with a delicate handkerchief. Mr. Everard cleared his throat, drawing a deep, measured breath. "The telegram hinted at a matter concerning our family's business in London," he explained. "But there was something odd about it. The wording, the timing, it seemed calculated to alarm rather than inform. We cannot say yet whether it is merely a nuisance or something more serious." Miss Marple listened, her fingers brushing the edge of her knitting bag as her mind sifted through the details. She noted the careful phrasing, the slight tremor in Mr. Everard's voice, and the flicker of unease in Mrs. Everard's eyes. It was rarely the words themselves, she reflected, but the manner in which they were delivered that revealed the heart of a matter. Before the conversation could continue, a sharp rap at the door announced the arrival of a new visitor. A young man, clearly from London, hurried in, clutching another envelope. He was flustered, glancing nervously from one member of the household to the next. "Mr. and Mrs. Everard," he panted. "I've brought further correspondence. It seems urgent." Mr. Everard accepted the envelope with a hand that trembled ever so slightly, and as he broke the seal, the room seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the young man's fidgeting hands, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the small hesitation before he spoke again. This cannot be coincidental," the young man stammered. "There is someone who knows about the London matter, someone who wishes to pressure the family. I was advised to deliver this immediately." As Mr. Everard read the contents, his face darkened and Mrs. Everard's grip on the arm of her chair tightened. Miss Marple, watching quietly, saw more than the words on paper. She saw the ripple of tension, the micro-expressions that betrayed fear, suspicion, and perhaps even the faintest trace of guilt. In that moment, she knew that the telegrams were not merely warnings. They were instruments, carefully placed, to provoke a reaction and to expose weaknesses. The household settled again, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. What had begun as a morning curiosity was now a tangible anxiety, a web of subtle threats and concealed motives. Miss Marple, knitting needles poised but idle, understood that her real task had begun, to unravel not only the overt messages, but the human currents beneath them, currents that might very well lead to something far darker than mere scandal or business entanglements. And in the flickering lamplight of the Everard drawing-room, she began to see patterns where others saw only alarm, whispers of intent where others only heard confusion, and the faint outline of a danger that had yet to fully reveal itself. Night had deepened over St. Mary Mead when Miss Marple finally took her leave from the Everard estate. The road back to Maplecroft Cottage was quiet, the lamplight casting a soft glow on the winding lanes. Yet in her mind, the pieces of the afternoon's revelations swirled like a careful mosaic forming in slow motion. Something about the telegrams, the timing of the delivery, and the young man's nervous arrival did not sit comfortably. She sensed a pattern, delicate but persistent, that hinted at manipulation rather than mere coincidence. Back in her own sitting room, the yellow envelope rested on the mantelpiece, almost as though it were waiting for her to fully consider it. Miss Marple took her usual chair by the window, knitting in hand, and let her thoughts drift along the quiet lines of observation she had so long relied upon. The villagers' reactions earlier that day, the whispered speculations, the sudden shifts in posture, the careful avoidance of certain subjects, were small clues, perhaps insignificant in isolation, but when woven together, they hinted at deeper unease. The next morning, the village stirred with an unusual energy. Word of the Everard telegrams had spread, carried by the ever-curious Mrs. Price and a dozen other intermediaries whose enthusiasm for gossip exceeded their discretion. The village streets, usually serene, now bore a hint of apprehension, a subtle tightness in the air that made people glance over their shoulders as they went about their errands. Miss Marple noted it with quiet satisfaction. Observation was often clearer in the reflections of others' unease. She paid a brief visit to the post office, ostensibly to collect letters and parcels, but in reality to listen. The clerk, a young woman with a penchant for whispering, spoke hurriedly to the customers, her tone revealing far more than the words themselves. "I never thought a telegram could cause so much fuss," she said, glancing toward Miss Marple. "People are already saying it could be some dreadful business in London or worse." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "And yet the words themselves tell very little. It is often the people who carry the messages who betray more than the messages themselves." She watched the clerk's quick nod and the subtle relaxation of her shoulders, a small signal of recognition and understanding that others would have overlooked entirely. By midday, curiosity and anxiety converged at the Red Lion, where the usual chatter was now punctuated by half-suppressed theories. Mr. Faraday was present, his usual air of nervous propriety now sharpened by speculation. He spoke freely, perhaps too freely, about London intrigues and imagined threats, all the while glancing repeatedly at those around him to gauge reactions. Miss Marple observed him quietly, noting the faint twitch of a lip when a particular theory was challenged, the subtle tension in his hands as he rearranged his napkin repeatedly. Miss Hamilton, for her part, seemed more guarded than ever. She lingered near the window, avoiding direct conversation, yet her eyes constantly tracked the movements of those in the room. Miss Marple, noting the combination of avoidance and attention, filed it away in her mind as one of the threads she would later examine more closely. It was during the late afternoon, as the sun slanted low across the village green, that a commotion arose at the Everard estate. A servant rushed into the Red Lion, breathless and flustered. "Sir and Madam Everard, there's been a burglary. The study was ransacked, but nothing seems to be taken. Still, it is unnerving." The villagers leaned forward, a mixture of excitement and concern crossing their features. Miss Marple remained calm, observing the ripple of reactions. Mr. Faraday was unusually pale. Mrs. Ledger's hands clasped tightly as she whispered possible motives aloud, and even the young innkeeper seemed to forget his usual cheerful composure. Miss Marple, quiet and composed, understood immediately that the incident was not random. The telegrams, the anxiety, the burglary, it was all connected, though how remained obscured. She noted that the room's disturbance was carefully selective. Papers had been shuffled, but nothing of real value taken, and the study's contents, letters, ledgers, and personal effects remained largely intact. Someone had entered to unsettle, to intimidate, perhaps to expose vulnerabilities. As she left the inn to return home, Miss Marple's mind worked with methodical precision. She did not yet know the full scope of the danger, nor the identity of those who might wish harm upon the Everards, but she sensed that the key lay not in what was missing, but in what had been deliberately left behind. The subtle disturbances, the reactions of the household, the nerves of the villagers, all were pieces of a puzzle that required patience, observation, and a deft understanding of human nature. And Miss Marple, knitting quietly by her window that evening, allowed the puzzle to unfold slowly in her mind, each new detail knitting itself seamlessly into the broader, intricate pattern she alone seemed able to discern. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, yet a faint tension hung over St. Mary Mead like a veil. Villagers moved with slightly hurried steps, casting occasional glances toward Maplecroft Cottage or the Everard estate, as if expecting the ordinary rhythm of life to fracture again. Miss Marple, as usual, went about her day with serene purpose, her knitting bag in hand and her keen eyes absorbing the smallest details. Her first stop was the Everard estate, where she had arranged a quiet visit under the guise of checking on their welfare after the unsettling burglary. The house seemed outwardly calm, yet there were subtle signs of lingering unease. A tray of tea left untouched on the side table, the scent of recently disturbed papers, and the faint trace of hurried footsteps in the hallway carpet. Mrs. Everard greeted her with a strained smile, clasping her hands tightly together. "I'm grateful you came, Miss Marple," she said. "It is comforting to have someone who is calm amid everything." Miss Marple nodded, seating herself near the fireplace. "Calm, yes, but I am also observant. You may rely on me to notice things that others overlook." Her eyes swept the room with a quiet intensity, noting the subtle twitch in Mr. Everard's jaw as he spoke of the burglary, the careful placement of papers that had been shuffled but not taken, and the shadow of worry in the servant's hesitant movements. "It is as though the intruder wished to frighten rather than steal," Miss Marple mused aloud, almost to herself. "And yet the selection of what was disturbed is telling." Mr. Everard frowned. "I cannot imagine who would wish us harm. There are business matters, of course, but nothing that should provoke this." Miss Marple allowed a faint, knowing smile. Often, the intention behind an action is not immediately apparent, but people reveal themselves in small, unconscious ways. The person who entered your study wanted you to feel the fragility of your own security. That is their true aim. As she spoke, a soft knock at the door heralded another visitor. It was young Miss Hamilton, looking hesitant yet determined. She carried a small notebook which she clutched as though it might protect her from the weight of the conversation. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I thought you might want to know something. I overheard a conversation between Mr. Faraday and a gentleman from London, something about a debt and threats, and it sounded serious." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you, my dear. Your attention to detail may prove quite important. Often the smallest pieces of information, when placed in context, reveal the larger truth." She watched Miss Hamilton's eyes flicker with the mix of fear and resolve, noting the way her hands twisted the notebook nervously. After the young woman left, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the Everards. "It seems there are more threads than we first suspected," she said gently, "and each is tied not only to the events of yesterday, but to the reactions and behaviors of those involved. To understand what is truly happening, one must consider not merely the act itself, but the people who carry it and the ways in which they respond." By midday, whispers of further disturbances reached the village. At the Red Lion, villagers spoke in lowered tones of strange visitors seen near the Everard estate, of unusual letters, and of Mr. Faraday's sudden absences. Some speculated wildly, conjuring improbable scenarios. Others merely muttered anxiously. Miss Marple listened quietly to each account, noting not the stories themselves, but the reactions they provoked. She observed how Mrs. Ledger eagerly clung to the most dramatic version, while Mr. Faraday grew defensive at even a gentle challenge to his account. The culmination of these small observations formed a subtle tapestry in Miss Marple's mind. Patterns were emerging, selective intimidation, concealed motives, and carefully hidden tensions among the villagers themselves. Each thread seemed to point toward a deeper truth, one that was as carefully hidden as it was urgent. By late afternoon, she returned to Maplecroft Cottage, her eyes drifting once more to the telegram on the mantelpiece. It remained unopened, yet its presence had become almost a lodestar, drawing her attention and demanding consideration. The fragments of the day, the burglary, the whispered debts, the visitor's nervousness, were coalescing in her mind. She understood, with the clarity born of years of quiet observation, that the answer would not be found in documents or possessions, but in human behavior, in the subtle betrayals and hesitations that only a patient observer could detect. And as the sun sank behind the rolling hills, casting a warm, amber glow over the village, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She had begun to see the outlines of the truth, delicate though they were, and she knew that the next hours would demand not haste, but careful, deliberate attention to every small detail and to every small lie. The following morning brought a damp, misty chill to St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself were still unsettled by the events of the previous days. Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar shawl, moved deliberately through the narrow lanes, observing the quiet stirrings of the villagers. Even the smallest gestures, Mrs. Price hastily closing her shop shutters, children peering anxiously around corners, Mr. Faraday's unusually brisk steps, spoke volumes. Human nature, she thought, revealed itself most clearly in moments of unease. Her first visit was once again to the Everard estate, this time under the pretense of offering assistance with household matters disturbed by the recent burglary. She was greeted by Mrs. Everard, who had evidently spent the night in a fitful half-sleep, her eyes shadowed with worry. "Miss Marple," she said, voice quivering slightly, "I hardly know what to do. It seems as if someone watches us at every turn. Even the servants are anxious, whispering among themselves." Miss Marple seated herself quietly, knitting in hand, listening carefully as Mrs. Everard recounted a series of minor but revealing incidents: misplaced letters, suspicious visitors who arrived unannounced, and a fleeting glimpse of a man lingering near the estate gates. "None of these seem connected," Mrs. Everard concluded, "but taken together, they make me fear there is more behind the telegram than we dared imagine." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It is often the pattern of events rather than each isolated moment that provides insight, and one must never underestimate the ingenuity of those who wish to conceal their intentions beneath a veil of ordinary actions." Just then, a discreet knock at the door announced another visitor. It was Mr. Faraday, looking unusually composed but with a faint shadow beneath his eyes. He carried an envelope, sealed in a manner that suggested urgency. "I thought you might like to see this," he said, placing it in Mrs. Everard's hands before retreating to a corner of the room. His movements were careful, deliberate, yet Miss Marple noted the subtle tremor in his fingers and the slight hesitation before he spoke, a small, telling sign of inner conflict. Mrs. Everard opened the envelope cautiously. The letter inside contained a brief but chilling message, its tone polite yet unmistakably threatening, a veiled warning about financial matters, coupled with an insinuation that someone close to the family might be compromised. Mrs. Everard's lips parted in silent alarm, and her hand trembled slightly as she clutched the paper. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the young man from London who had delivered a previous correspondence. He had returned without announcement, standing just outside the sitting room, his expression tense. The way he lingered, unwilling to intrude yet unwilling to leave, was a subtle but revealing clue. Miss Marple made a mental note. People often show more truth in what they avoid saying than in what they speak outright. Later that morning, she paid a brief visit to the post office, ostensibly to collect routine letters. There she overheard a few villagers speculating about the latest letter and its threatening undertones. Mr. Faraday, naturally, had already become the focus of whispered conjecture. Miss Marple, however, noted the inconsistencies in the accounts. One version claimed he had seemed frightened, another that he had appeared entirely composed. The contradiction itself was significant, for it suggested either deliberate deception or a keen awareness of observation on someone else's part. Returning home, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet reflection by the window. The threads were converging: telegrams, threatening letters, the burglary, and the nervous behavior of those around the Everard estate. Yet no single clue pointed definitively toward the instigator. She understood that the solution would not come from documents or possessions, but from watching human reactions, the subtle hesitations, the involuntary gestures, the flickers of conscience that betrayed intent. As the afternoon light faded and the mist thickened along the lanes, Miss Marple felt a small, reassuring certainty. The investigation had entered a crucial phase, one in which observation, patience, and a careful reading of human behavior would reveal what was deliberately hidden. And though the village seemed tranquil on the surface, beneath it, currents of fear, suspicion, and concealed motives were beginning to align, drawing her closer to the revelation that lay just beyond the ordinary eye. The next morning brought a heavier mist to St. Mary Mead, muffling the usual sounds of the village and lending an almost secretive hush to the lanes. Miss Marple, walking slowly along the familiar path to the Everard estate, noticed immediately the unusual quiet. Windows were shuttered, gates closed more firmly than usual, and even the faint clatter of a cart seemed muted. The household, she suspected, was bracing itself for further disturbances, aware that the previous day's events were unlikely to conclude so quietly. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation. Mrs. Everard, still pale from the recent worries, greeted her with a small, anxious smile. "Miss Marple, I hardly know what to do. There is news, though I cannot say yet how significant it is." Miss Marple set down her knitting and inclined her head. Sometimes it is in the small things, the seemingly trivial details, that the most telling revelations are found. She watched Mrs. Everard's quick intake of breath, noting the slight tremor in her fingers as she clasped them together. Before more could be said, a servant entered hastily, bearing a note. The young woman's eyes were wide with unease as she handed it to Mr. Everard, who unfolded it with deliberate care. The telegram contained only a few terse lines, instructions that seemed to hint at a meeting in London, coupled with a vague threat if the instructions were not followed precisely. The language was polite but unmistakably menacing. Mr. Everard's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked at Miss Marple as though seeking counsel. She did not offer judgment, only a calm, assessing gaze. The situation, she knew, demanded patience and careful attention to reactions rather than rash decisions. Later that morning, Miss Marple wandered quietly through the village, listening as the gossip of the previous night had taken root. At the Red Lion, the innkeeper reported a sighting of a stranger near the Everard gates, someone who had been lingering with a too careful casualness. Mr. Faraday, present in the room, flushed visibly at the mention, though he said nothing. Miss Marple observed him discreetly, noting the brief tightening of his hands, the flicker of unease in his eyes. It was small, almost imperceptible, yet significant. Miss Hamilton, too, appeared in the conversation, her earlier discretion giving way to nervous excitement. "I think," she began cautiously, "that someone is watching everyone, trying to see who will react. I overheard Mr. Faraday speaking to someone on the phone very late last night, though I did not catch the full conversation. It sounded urgent." Miss Marple's mind, always attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, registered the moment. The overlapping threads, telegrams, letters, a staged burglary, unusual visitors, and overheard conversations, began to form a clearer picture. Each person's reaction offered insight into their knowledge, fears, and potential involvement. The pattern was emerging, though deliberately obscured by layers of misdirection. By afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the Everard estate, where a sense of urgency now hovered in the air. Mr. Everard, usually composed, paced the study floor, occasionally glancing at the window as though expecting someone to appear. Mrs. Everard remained seated, hands clasped tightly, while the servants moved with careful, anxious efficiency. Miss Marple observed silently, noting every twitch, glance, and hesitation. A sudden knock at the door announced another visitor, a middle-aged gentleman from London, whose arrival seemed to heighten the household's tension. He carried a sealed envelope, which he handed to Mr. Everard with a polite nod. "It seems matters have escalated," he said quietly. The instructions are very clear, and the consequences, I am afraid, are serious." As Mr. Everard read, his face darkened. Miss Marple, ever attentive to nuance, saw more than the written words. The tremor of his lips, the slight tightening around his eyes, and the subtle, almost imperceptible sigh of Mrs. Everard. Each was a signal, a reflection of fear and apprehension that could not be faked. By the time Miss Marple left the estate, the threads had multiplied, each leading in unexpected directions. Telegrams, letters, strangers, eavesdropping, and nerves fraying under pressure, all hinted at a hidden motive, carefully orchestrated and closely guarded. Miss Marple understood that the next step would require not documents or testimony, but a careful orchestration of human observation. The real truth, she knew, would reveal itself only when the right person let their guard slip, and she intended to watch with the patience that had always served her well. That evening, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy quiet, the sort of hush that presaged something significant just beneath the surface. Miss Marple, knitting calmly by the window at Maplecroft Cottage, was aware that the events of the past days were converging toward a moment that would demand careful attention. Her eyes, sharp and unassuming, flicked to the mantelpiece where the yellow telegram lay untouched, a silent reminder that the true danger had yet to make itself fully known. A discreet knock at the door brought her out of thought. It was Miss Hamilton, still clutching her notebook, her expression a mixture of apprehension and determination. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I think something is about to happen. I overheard Mr. Faraday talking to someone else, someone I've never seen before. They were speaking in hushed tones about a meeting, and there was urgency in their voices." Miss Marple nodded, motioning for her young companion to sit. "You have done well to notice, my dear. Observation is often more revealing than words, and people speak without realizing the truth they betray." Her mind turned over the fragments she had collected over the past days. The telegrams, the threatening letters, the staged burglary, the nervous glances, and overheard conversations. Each incident, isolated, might seem inconsequential, yet together they formed a subtle, intricate pattern of deliberate manipulation. As the evening deepened, a carriage rattled along the cobbled lane outside Maplecroft Cottage. Miss Marple rose quietly and peered through the lace curtains. The carriage, unusual at this hour, bore a London crest and carried a solitary figure whose purpose was immediately unclear. Miss Marple's intuition, honed over years of observing human behavior, suggested that the visitor's arrival was not accidental. Moments later, the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find the middle-aged gentleman from London whose presence at the Everard estate she had noted the previous day. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I hope I'm not intruding. I've come to deliver some information that may be critical. It concerns the Everard family and, well, I feared it prudent to speak with you first." Inviting him inside, Miss Marple offered tea while she listened carefully. The man's words were measured and precise. He spoke of a series of transactions and correspondences that, while appearing innocuous, had been deliberately designed to unsettle the Everards and those around them. The language was subtle, calculated to provoke fear and hesitation rather than to convey immediate danger. Miss Marple, knitting quietly as she absorbed the details, considered the implications. The letters, the telegrams, and the recent staged intrusion at the estate were not isolated acts. They were carefully orchestrated. Someone sought to manipulate the household, to observe their reactions, and to expose vulnerabilities. The question, she realized, was not only who was behind it, but why, and which of the villagers might be entangled, knowingly or not, in the unfolding scheme. Miss Hamilton, observing the exchange, whispered, "Do you think it could be someone from the village? Someone we've seen but not suspected?" Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "It is often the case, my dear, that the person closest at hand is the one who can best exploit trust. but to identify them, one must observe carefully. Watch how people behave when they believe no one is noticing. Subtlety reveals more than confrontation ever could. The conversation continued into the night, the flickering lamplight casting shadows that danced across the walls like the hidden truths Miss Marple was beginning to trace. She understood that the next day would bring an opportunity, not forced but carefully constructed, to observe the reactions of those around her. One false move, one slight hesitation would reveal far more than words or documents ever could. As she finally closed the door to her guest and returned to her chair by the window, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The threads of the mystery were drawing together. The telegram on the mantelpiece, the letters, the nervous behaviors, and the strange visitor, all were part of a design that, with patience and attention, she could unravel. And in that quiet, shadowed evening, she sensed that the critical moment, the one in which the true character of the culprit would be revealed, was approaching swiftly, like a tide rolling in silently beneath the calm of the village night. The following morning arrived damp and grey, the mist clinging low over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, seated by her window with knitting in hand, watched the quiet streets with her usual patient attention. The past day's events had unsettled the villagers, and even the smallest gestures, an unsteady step, a lowered voice, a glance cast too quickly, seemed charged with significance. She knew, as she always did, that these small signals often revealed more than any document or confession could. By mid-morning, she made her way toward the Everard estate once more. The house appeared outwardly normal, yet subtle signs betrayed the household's unease. A tray of untouched tea in the drawing-room, servants moving with a hesitant deliberation, and the faint scent of recently disturbed papers that had not been properly restored to order. Mrs. Everard greeted her at the door, pale and anxious, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "there have been more indications. A stranger was seen near the gates yesterday evening, and some letters have arrived that, while unsigned, bear a threatening tone. The household is on edge." Miss Marple nodded, setting down her knitting. "It seems, my dear, that someone wishes to provoke anxiety more than they wish to commit any overt act. And in such matters, it is often the reactions of the people observed that provide the clearest insight." Her eyes swept the room with quiet scrutiny, noting the tension in Mr. Everard's jaw as he spoke, the subtle clenching of Mrs. Everard's fingers, and the wary glances of the servants, each betraying an awareness of danger they could neither name nor resist. A soft knock at the door heralded the arrival of a young messenger who handed a small envelope to Mr. Everard before quickly retreating. The letter was brief, polite in tone yet menacing in intent, suggesting that certain instructions must be followed or consequences would ensue. Mr. Everard's hands trembled as he read, and Mrs. Everard's lips pressed tightly together. Miss Marple, observing silently, registered every flicker of fear and hesitation. It was in these subtle reactions that the true message lay. Later that morning, she visited the Red Lion, where the usual hum of gossip had grown urgent. Villagers spoke in low, anxious tones about the latest letters and visitors. Mr. Faraday, present in the room, displayed a mixture of agitation and calculated composure, his every movement betraying more than his carefully measured words. Miss Hamilton, equally nervous, whispered her observations. A late-night conversation overheard, a hurried visit from an unknown man, the urgency in voices meant to remain concealed. Miss Marple listened quietly, noting not only what was said, but how it was said. The slight faltering of a voice, the avoidance of certain topics, the nervous fidgeting of hands. Each detail, though seemingly minor, added another thread to the intricate pattern she was beginning to discern. It was not yet clear who orchestrated the disturbances, but the reactions of those involved were already hinting at motives, fears, and hidden alliances. By afternoon, she returned to Maplecroft Cottage, the yellow telegram still resting on the mantelpiece, its presence a quiet reminder of the chain of events it had set in motion. She sat by the window, knitting idle loops as her mind traced the connections between letters, telegrams, strangers, and villagers alike. Someone had engineered this cascade of anxiety, and the careful observation of human behavior would be the key to discovering not only who, but why. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the mist-shrouded lanes outside, noting a figure moving cautiously along the street, pausing at intervals to look toward the Everard estate. Her heart, calm as ever, recognized the significance of such movement. Surveillance, testing reactions, or perhaps planting subtle hints to observe the household's response. The threads were converging, and she understood that the next hours would bring an opportunity to observe the culprit's careful, yet inevitably revealing, actions. In the quiet of her sitting room, with the village cloaked in grey and suspense, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. The hidden currents of fear, manipulation, and subtle deceit were beginning to surface, and she, as always, would watch patiently, aware that the smallest slip, the tiniest hesitation, would expose the truth more clearly than any direct accusation ever could. The following morning, the village seemed suspended between routine and apprehension, as if every resident were quietly bracing for some unseen revelation. Miss Marple, seated at her window with knitting in hand, observed the subtle movements of the villagers, a cautious exchange of greetings, hurried steps along the cobbled lanes, the lingering glance of someone who hoped to remain unnoticed. Each motion, each hesitation, was a note in the larger symphony of human behavior that she had been carefully listening to for days. It was mid-morning when she received an unexpected visit from the young messenger who had brought letters to the Everards. The boy, wide-eyed and nervous, carried another envelope. Smaller than the last, yet its presence carried a gravity all its own. Miss Marple took it from him, noting the slight tremor in his hands, the hesitation before he spoke. "This was delivered to the Everards very early this morning," he murmured. "I thought it best you see it." Opening the envelope quietly, Miss Marple read the brief, carefully worded lines. The telegram had a tone that was polite, almost deferential, yet it hinted at consequences and demanded action. It was designed to unsettle, to provoke a response. She placed it on the table, considering not the message itself, but the people whose behavior it would now influence. By noon, she made her way toward the Everard estate, her mind attentive to every detail. The household had settled into a tense routine, each member acutely aware that someone, somewhere, was orchestrating their anxiety. Miss Marple noted subtle signs: a nervous glance toward the windows, the careful adjustment of a chair, the restrained tone in which Mrs. Everard spoke. These were the indicators of unease that would guide her toward the truth. As she arrived, she was quietly ushered into the drawing-room, where Mr. and Mrs. Everard, along with a few of their closest staff, had gathered. Their expressions were marked by apprehension, yet under that tension were traces of curiosity, suspicion, and something else, an awareness that the moment of revelation was approaching. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting micro-expressions that revealed more than words could convey. Mr. Faraday, seated near the window, adjusted his cuff nervously. Miss Hamilton's hands trembled slightly as she held her notebook. Even the servants seemed to anticipate some pivotal event. Each person's reaction was a subtle clue, and Miss Marple knew that the truth would emerge not from what had been written, but from what could not be concealed. A sudden, discreet knock at the door announced another visitor, and all eyes turned. The London gentleman, who had appeared previously with correspondence for the Everards, stepped in, carrying one final envelope. "I believe this may clarify matters," he said softly, placing it before Mr. Everard. The household held its collective breath as Mr. Everard read, The tension in the room heightened. The letter, carefully constructed, revealed the intricate web of manipulation, a chain of threats, provocations, and carefully timed disturbances designed to observe reactions, test loyalties, and expose hidden motives. Miss Marple, watching every flicker of emotion, every micro-reaction, realized that the orchestrator's hand was not only skilled but intimately familiar with human nature. It was then, with the room charged by anxiety and anticipation, that Miss Marple began her subtle psychological test. She engaged Mr. Faraday in casual conversation, allowing the questions to flow naturally, observing closely the way he responded to gentle probes. Every hesitation, every misalignment between words and behavior was noted meticulously. She did the same with others, her calm demeanor disguising the sharp scrutiny behind her eyes. By mid-afternoon, the pattern was clear. Miss Marple had seen the small signs that revealed truth beneath pretense, and she could now trace the thread of the orchestrator's actions from the letters, the telegrams, and the staged intrusions directly to the person who had subtly manipulated events all along. The clues had been there for those willing to see them: selective disruptions, exaggerated reactions, and the way certain individuals moved and spoke when they thought themselves unobserved. With quiet authority, she addressed the room. Her voice was gentle, yet carried a precision that left no room for doubt. She explained how each act had been designed to provoke a response, how each letter, telegram, and intrusion fit into a careful sequence, and how human behavior, unconsciously revealing, had allowed her to trace the true source of the disturbances. One by one, she revealed the key observations, showing how they pointed unerringly to the orchestrator. As the room absorbed her words, a stunned silence fell. Then, with a mixture of relief and chagrin, the culprit's composure faltered, revealing the truth that Miss Marple had anticipated. In a calm, decisive manner, she explained how every seemingly trivial detail had contributed to the ultimate revelation. The household, though shaken, could finally comprehend the intricate machinations that had unsettled them for so long. The day drew to a close with St. Mary Mead returning, at least outwardly, to its usual calm. Yet beneath the familiar routines, a quiet unease lingered, a reminder that human motives, carefully concealed, could be as perilous as any overt threat. Miss Marple, seated once more at her window with her knitting, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She had witnessed the unveiling of truth not through force or confrontation, but through patience, observation, and a keen understanding of human nature, an understanding that, as always, proved quietly decisive. The village of St. Mary Mead seemed quieter than usual, as if the events of the previous days had left a lingering hush over its lanes and cottages. Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting in hand, observed the familiar rhythms of daily life, noting with her usual attention the small gestures and hesitations of the villagers. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a mix of relief and unease, as people moved about, aware that something had been resolved, yet uncertain what the future might hold. At Maplecroft Cottage, she received a brief visit from Mrs. Everard, who had come to express her gratitude. Her eyes, still shadowed by recent anxieties, reflected a quiet relief. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I cannot thank you enough. You have not only uncovered the truth, but spared us from unnecessary suspicion and panic. The household feels lighter somehow, knowing the danger has been revealed." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It is often the case, my dear, that people are unaware of the patterns that guide events until someone observes them carefully. The truth is usually less dramatic than imagination makes it, yet far more revealing when one knows where to look." She noticed, as she always did, the subtle relaxation in Mrs. Everard's posture, the easing of tension in her hands, a small but telling confirmation that the household's nerves were beginning to settle. Later in the day, Miss Marple walked quietly through the village lanes, observing the villagers as they went about their routines. The post office, the bakery, and the Red Lion all carried the faint hum of gossip. Yet it was tempered now by a sense of closure. Mr. Faraday, usually prone to anxious speculation, moved with a steadier air, and even Miss Hamilton's notebook remained largely untouched, her earlier vigilance giving way to a quieter attentiveness. Miss Marple noted these changes carefully. Human nature, once disturbed, took time to return to equilibrium, and the traces of fear and suspicion could linger long after the events themselves had concluded. In the late afternoon, she returned to Maplecroft Cottage and sat by the mantelpiece, the yellow telegram still resting where it had first arrived. She allowed herself a reflective moment, considering the series of events that had unfolded. The initial alarm, the subtle manipulations, the careful observations, and the eventual revelation of the orchestrator's identity. Each small detail, each hesitation, each micro-expression had contributed to the understanding she had pieced together, a testament to the quiet power of patient observation and understanding of human behavior. As twilight fell, casting soft shadows over the village, Miss Marple mused on the nature of human motives. In St. Mary Mead, as elsewhere, the veneer of civility and routine often concealed deep anxieties, hidden resentments, and carefully guarded secrets. It was the small signs, the tiny inconsistencies in behavior that revealed the true shape of events, and it was in noticing these, with patience and discretion, that the mind could uncover truths others overlooked. And so, as the lamps in the cottages flickered on and the evening settled peacefully over the village, Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, knitting and reflecting. The telegram on the mantelpiece had sparked a chain of events that revealed much more than anyone had anticipated. And the village, though returning to its ordinary rhythms, now carried with it the subtle knowledge that the truth, however carefully hidden, could never remain entirely concealed from a discerning eye. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of Maplecroft Cottage, illuminating Miss Marple's knitting and the quiet room in which she had spent so many hours observing, reflecting, and piecing together the threads of a mystery that had gripped St. Mary Mead. The village outside was now fully awake, its streets carrying the familiar sounds of life. Footsteps along the lanes, the clatter of shop doors opening, and the occasional cheerful greetings between neighbors. But beneath the surface, there was a subtle shift. The tension that had held the village in uneasy suspense was loosening, replaced by a reflective calm. Miss Marple sat quietly, her gaze resting on the yellow telegram that had first brought intrigue to the Everard estate. It remained where she had placed it, an unassuming marker of events that had cascaded from a single sheet of paper into a revelations of human motives and hidden designs. She allowed herself a moment to review in her mind the journey from alarm to resolution, the telegram, the letters, the staged burglary, the visitors, the subtle tests of behavior, and the careful observations that had led her, step by step, to the truth. By mid-morning, she made her way to the Everard estate for what she knew would be a final conversation with the household. The mood was markedly lighter than it had been, yet a respectful gravity remained, as though the family were still processing the revelation. Mrs. Everard greeted her warmly, a genuine smile illuminating her face for the first time in days. "Miss Marple, it is as though a weight has been lifted. We see now how easily fear can grow when one does not understand the forces at work." Miss Marple inclined her head, her own expression serene. "Understanding is a quiet sort of power, Mrs. Everard. Often, the truth lies not in confrontation, but in observation, in noticing the reactions, hesitations, and gestures that reveal what people attempt to conceal." Her eyes briefly met those of Mr. Everard, who nodded in silent acknowledgement of the insight she offered. They spoke at length, reviewing the recent events, and Miss Marple explained in gentle terms how the orchestrator had manipulated anxieties, used subtle threats, and relied upon human tendencies to mislead and unsettle. She described how each minor clue, the misplaced papers, the carefully delivered letters, the nervous visitors, had pointed toward the ultimate truth. As she spoke, the Everard's relief became palpable, the layers of worry peeling away in the light of understanding. Later, as Miss Marple walked back through the village, she noted the subtle yet pervasive shift in the air. Conversations in the streets carried a lighter tone. The Red Lion hummed with ordinary chatter rather than anxious speculation. And even the villagers who had been most quick to fear now moved with the cautious composure of those who had learned, through careful observation, the difference between perception and reality. Returning to Maplecroft Cottage, she settled once more by the window, knitting as she reflected on human nature and the quiet intricacies that often go unnoticed. The telegram, now no longer a harbinger of fear but a symbol of insight, rested upon the mantelpiece, a reminder that even the smallest actions could ripple outward with unforeseen consequences. Miss Marple considered the subtle lessons of the past days. Patience, discretion, and attention to detail were as vital in understanding human motives as any other skill. As the sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long, gentle shadows across the village lanes, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The Everards had regained their peace, the village had returned to its ordinary rhythms, and yet the events of the past days had left an indelible mark, a quiet acknowledgement that beneath the surface of daily life, human nature's complexities could always yield surprises for the observant eye. With that comforting thought, she returned to her knitting, content in the knowledge that the mystery had been resolved and that, as always, careful observation and understanding of human behavior had quietly, decisively prevailed.